silence. That's where the real gunfights of the American West began. Not with the dramatic standoffs Hollywood taught you to expect, but with a suffocating quiet that pressed down on dusty streets like a heavy blanket. Tonight, we're stepping into those forgotten moments when time stood still and ordinary men faced their mortality with trembling hands and racing hearts. Forget everything you think you know about the Wild West. The truth is far more human, far more terrifying, and infinitely more real than any movie could capture. Picture the main street of Dodge City, Kansas, on a sweltering afternoon in July 1875. The sun beats down mercilessly, creating heat waves that dance above the packed dirt road. The wooden sidewalks creak under the weight of nervous footsteps. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, then falls silent. Even the wind seems to hold its breath. Two men stand 30 feet apart, but they might as well be separated by an eternity. The first man is John Wesley Hardin, 22 years old and already responsible for the deaths of 27 human beings. His reputation preceded him into every saloon, every hotel, every conversation whispered behind closed doors. But standing there in the heat, watching sweat drip from his hat brim, he doesn't look like a killer. He looks like what he is. A scared young man whose hands shake slightly as they hover near his guns. The second man is Sheriff Jim Taylor, 45 years old, with gray threading through his hair and lines etched deep around his eyes. He's survived 12 gunfights, but each one left its mark. Not just on his body, though he carries those scars too, but on something deeper. Something that makes his stomach clench and his throat go dry every time he hears his name called out in challenge. But here's what Hollywood never shows you. This wasn't going to be a duel. Real gunfights in the American West weren't elegant affairs governed by codes of honor. They were desperate, violent, and usually over in seconds. Most of them weren't even called gunfights at the time. People called them killings, murders, or simply bad business. The romantic notion of the noble gunslinger came later, invented by dime novelists who'd never been west of the Mississippi River. Hardin knew this. He'd built his reputation not on fair fights, but on being faster to draw, quicker to shoot, and more willing to kill than anyone else. He'd shot men in the back, killed them while they slept, gunned them down during card games when they were drunk and slow. Honor was a luxury for men who expected to live long enough to enjoy it. Taylor knew this too. He'd been wearing a badge for 15 years, and he'd learned that the law wasn't about justice or fairness. It was about staying alive long enough to keep the peace. Sometimes that meant shooting first. Sometimes it meant shooting from cover. And sometimes it meant walking away from fights you couldn't win, no matter what the town council expected of you. The tension stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight. Somewhere behind Hardin, a saloon door creaked. Someone was watching from the shadows, probably placing bets on who would be carried to Boot Hill before sundown. Death was entertainment in towns like Dodge City, where life was cheap and distractions were few. The local undertaker, a thin man named Morrison, was probably already measuring his next customer in his mind. What happened next wasn't anything like the movies. There was no dramatic countdown, no moment when both men reached for their guns simultaneously. Instead, Hardin made his move suddenly, without warning, his right hand flashing toward the Colt .45 on his hip. But Taylor had been expecting this. He'd been sheriff long enough to read the signs. The subtle shift in Hardin's stance, the way his eyes narrowed, the almost imperceptible tensing of his shoulders. Taylor didn't reach for his gun. He dove to his left, behind a water trough, even as Hardin's pistol cleared leather. The shot that would have taken Taylor in the chest instead splintered the wooden post behind him, sending fragments flying. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the street like thunder, unnaturally loud in the thin air. Horses reared and whinnied in their hitches. Women screamed from the safety of doorways. From behind the water trough, Taylor drew his own weapon, a well-maintained Colt 44 that he'd cleaned and loaded that morning. His hands were steady now. The moment of truth had arrived, and his training took over. He could hear Hardin cursing, probably looking for better cover. There would be a moment when the young killer would expose himself, and Taylor would have to be ready. This was the reality of Western gunfights. Not two men standing bravely in the open, testing their speed and accuracy, but a deadly game of cat and mouse played out behind whatever cover could be found. Gunfighters who survived to middle age weren't the ones who were fastest on the draw. They were the ones smart enough to avoid fair fights altogether. The smell of gunpowder drifted through the air, acrid and sharp. It mixed with the ever-present odors of horse manure, dust, and unwashed bodies that defined frontier towns. Somewhere, a baby cried, probably startled by the gunshot. The normal sounds of daily life, the conversations and laughter and business transactions, had stopped completely. The entire town held its breath, waiting to see who would walk away. Hardin made his next mistake by calling out a challenge. In a real gunfight, talking just gave away your position and wasted time that could mean the difference between life and death. But Hardin was young, angry, and probably scared despite his reputation. "Come out and face me like a man, Taylor," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. Taylor said nothing. He'd learned long ago that in a gunfight, silence was your friend. He moved carefully along the water trough, keeping low, using the wooden structure for protection while he tried to get a better angle on Hardin's position. His boots made no sound on the dirt. Every sense was heightened. He could hear his own heartbeat, could smell his own sweat, could feel the weight of the gun in his hand like it was part of his body. What most people don't understand about gunfights in the Old West is how short they actually were. Most lasted less than 30 seconds, from first shot to final body hitting the ground. There were no extended duels, no lengthy exchanges of gunfire. Men carried single-action revolvers that held 6 rounds, and reloading under fire was nearly impossible. You had your 6 shots, and if you hadn't finished the job by then, you were probably dead. The psychological pressure was enormous. Every second stretched like an hour. Every sound seemed amplified. The scrape of a boot on wood, the jingle of spurs, the whisper of leather against metal as someone adjusted their grip on their gun. These tiny sounds could mean the difference between seeing another sunset or joining the growing population of Boot Hill Cemetery. Hardin fired again, this time at where he thought Taylor might be hiding. The bullet gouged a chunk out of the water trough, sending splinters flying and water seeping through the fresh hole. But Taylor had already moved. He came around the end of the trough in a low crouch, his gun trained on the doorway where he'd seen muzzle flash. For just a moment, both men could see each other clearly. Hardin, pressed against the wall of the barber shop, his gun raised but not quite aimed. Taylor, crouched beside the water trough, his weapon steady and pointing directly at Hardin's chest. In that frozen instant, time seemed to stop. Both men knew that only one of them would walk away from this encounter. What happened next illustrates the brutal reality of frontier justice. Taylor fired first, not because he was faster, but because he was in a better position and had taken the time to aim properly. His bullet caught Hardin in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his gun. In that moment, John Wesley Hardin, the most feared gunfighter in Texas, became just another wounded man crying for his mother. But the story doesn't end there. Because real gunfights weren't just about who could shoot fastest or most accurately. They were about who was willing to do whatever it took to survive. As Hardin fell to his knees, clutching his shattered shoulder, he reached for a derringer hidden in his boot. A sneak gun, they called it. A hideout weapon for desperate moments. Taylor saw the movement and didn't hesitate. His second shot took Hardin's center mass, lifting him off his feet and slamming him back against the barbershop wall. The sound was different this time. Not the sharp crack of a bullet hitting wood, but the wet, meaty thud of lead meeting flesh. Hardin slumped to the ground and didn't move again. The silence that followed was different from the one that had started the fight. This was the silence of death, heavy and final. Smoke from the gunshots drifted lazily in the still air. The smell of blood began to mix with the gunpowder. Flies would be there soon, drawn by the scent. Death in frontier towns was quick to attract its attendants. Taylor stood slowly, his gun still trained on Hardin's motionless form. He'd learned never to assume a man was dead until you'd checked for a pulse. Too many lawmen had been killed by opponents they thought were finished. He approached carefully, watching for any sign of movement, any indication that Hardin might still be a threat. But John Wesley Hardin, the man who had terrorized Texas for 5 years, was truly finished. His eyes stared sightlessly at the cloudless sky. Blood pooled beneath his body, darkening the dirt and attracting the attention of a stray dog that slunk closer, drawn by the scent. This was how legends died in the real West. Not in glorious battle, but bleeding out in the dust while dogs sniffed at their wounds. The townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places. Shopkeepers peered out from behind overturned tables. Women gathered their children closer and whispered prayers of thanks that the violence was over. The saloon doors swung open, and men who had been diving for cover moments earlier now strutted out to examine the body and claim they'd seen the whole thing. This was another reality of the Wild West that Hollywood chose to ignore. Death was a public spectacle. Bodies weren't rushed away to preserve the dignity of the deceased. They were left where they fell until the undertaker arrived, sometimes hours later. People would come to stare, to touch the corpse, to take souvenirs. Children would dare each other to poke the dead man with sticks. Death was entertainment, education, and reminder, all rolled into one grim package. Taylor holstered his gun and walked over to Hardin's body. He knelt down and closed the dead man's eyes, a gesture of respect that cost him nothing, but spoke to the complicated morality of the frontier. Hardin had been a killer, a man who'd taken 27 lives, but he'd also been someone's son. Somewhere, a woman was about to receive news that would destroy her world. The sheriff checked Hardin's weapons, removing the derringer from his boot and the backup knife from his belt. Even in death, dangerous men remained dangerous to the unwary. Their weapons would be sold, probably to the highest bidder. Nothing went to waste on the frontier, especially nothing as valuable as a well-made gun. As Taylor stood, he noticed his hands shaking. Not from fear now, but from the aftermath of violence. This was something else the movies never showed. The human cost of killing, even justified killing. Even when you walked away alive, even when you'd done everything right, taking a life left marks that didn't show on the surface. Marks that accumulated over time until some men couldn't bear the weight anymore. But there was no time for reflection. Already a crowd was gathering. Men wanted to know exactly what had happened. Who had drawn first? How many shots were fired? Was it a fair fight? These questions mattered in a society where reputation was everything, and the line between hero and villain could shift depending on which version of events people chose to believe. The truth was, most gunfights in the Wild West weren't fair at all. They were ambushes, assassinations, executions carried out in the heat of passion or cold calculation. The romantic ideal of two gunfighters facing each other at high noon was mostly fiction, created by writers who understood that readers wanted heroes and villains, not the messy reality of desperate men killing each other over money, women, or wounded pride. As the sun began to set over Dodge City that evening, John Wesley Hardin's body was finally loaded onto a wagon and taken to the undertaker. His guns were sold to a collector from back east who wanted authentic Western artifacts. His boots went to a cowboy who couldn't afford new ones. His hat was claimed by a bartender who thought it would make a good conversation piece. By midnight, the blood had been covered with fresh dirt, and the only evidence of the day's violence was a few bullet holes in the barbershop wall. The town settled into an uneasy peace, the kind that comes after a storm has passed, but before anyone knows whether another one is brewing on the horizon. In a place where violence was always just one harsh word away, peace was a temporary gift that wise men didn't take for granted. But the story of that gunfight would be told and retold for decades. Each telling would add new details, remove inconvenient truths, and gradually transform a brutal killing into something resembling a fair fight between honorable men. This is how legends are born, not from truth, but from humanity's endless need to find nobility in violence, honor in desperation, and heroes in the darkness of ordinary human failings. The newspapers that arrived on the evening train would carry wildly different versions of the same event. The Kansas City Star would describe a heroic lawman facing down a notorious killer in defense of civilization itself. The Texas papers would paint Hardin as a young man driven to violence by corrupt lawmen who had murdered his friends and family. Both versions would contain enough truth to be believable and enough fiction to be inspiring. Neither would capture the sweaty, terrified reality of two men trying to kill each other in a dusty street. Within a week, the story had reached the dime novel publishers in New York City. Men who understood that the public's appetite for Western adventure stories was apparently limitless. They would transform Sheriff Taylor into a square-jawed hero with nerves of steel and an unshakable moral compass. John Wesley Hardin would become a sneering villain who terrorized innocent families and laughed at the suffering of his victims. The real men, with their human failings and complex motivations, would disappear beneath layers of commercial fiction. The weapons used in the gunfight would also become part of the mythology. Hardin's Colt .45 would be claimed by the sheriff's office, cataloged as evidence, and eventually sold at auction to a collector from Chicago who displayed it in his private museum. The gun itself told a different story than the legends that grew up around it. The grip was worn smooth from years of handling. The metal showed the scars of hard use, and the mechanism had been modified by a frontier gunsmith who valued function over appearance. Taylor's weapon would remain in his possession until his death 15 years later, when it was passed down to his son, who had never fired a gun in anger and hoped he never would. The younger Taylor would eventually move to San Francisco, where he became a successful merchant and told people that his father had been a businessman in Kansas. The gun gathered dust in a closet, its violent history as buried as the men it had killed. The physical evidence of the gunfight itself would fade quickly. The bloodstains in the dirt were washed away by the first hard rain. The bullet holes in the barbershop wall were patched within a month. The only permanent reminder was a small wooden cross that someone, probably Hardin's sister, had placed in the cemetery on the hill overlooking town. Even that would disappear within a few years, replaced by newer graves and fresher tragedies. But the psychological impact of the gunfight would linger much longer. Children who had witnessed the violence would carry those memories for the rest of their lives, jumping at sudden sounds and having nightmares about blood and gunfire. Women who had hidden behind doors and windows would develop a nervous condition that made them flinch whenever a man raised his voice or moved too quickly. The entire community would be subtly changed by what they had seen, scarred in ways that wouldn't heal for decades. Sheriff Taylor himself was not immune to these effects. Friends noticed that he drank more heavily after the shooting, that he was quicker to anger and slower to trust. He began carrying a backup gun and sleeping with his weapon under his pillow. The confidence that had once made him an effective lawman gradually eroded. replaced by a paranoia that would eventually force him to resign his position and move to a quieter town, where his reputation wouldn't attract challengers. The economic impact of frontier violence extended far beyond the immediate participants. Businesses suffered when customers were afraid to venture out after dark. Property values declined in areas known for gunfights and violence. Insurance companies began charging higher premiums for policies in frontier towns, if they would write policies at all. The cost of maintaining law and order consumed an increasingly large portion of municipal budgets, money that could have been spent on schools, roads, and other improvements that might have attracted respectable settlers. The regional impact was equally significant. Eastern investors were reluctant to fund businesses in areas they perceived as lawless and dangerous. Railroad companies charged higher freight rates to compensate for the risk of robbery and violence. Skilled workers and professionals often chose to settle in more peaceful communities, leaving frontier towns with populations skewed toward young, single men with few ties to the community and little stake in its future development. This created a vicious cycle, where violence bred more violence. Towns that couldn't attract stable families and established businesses became dependent on the very industries that generated the most conflict. Cattle drives, mining operations, and transportation hubs all brought together large numbers of armed men with money to spend, and few outlets for entertainment beyond drinking, gambling, and fighting. The communities that served these industries became trapped in a pattern of boom and bust, prosperity and violence, that would continue until the frontier itself finally closed. The legal system of the frontier was itself part of the problem. Courts were often hundreds of miles away, making it difficult to prosecute crimes or resolve disputes through legal channels. Local lawmen were frequently outgunned and outnumbered by the criminal elements they were supposed to control. Justice, when it came at all, was often swift and final, dispensed from the barrel of a gun rather than the bench of a courtroom. This created an environment where personal reputation and the willingness to use violence became more important than legal authority or moral principle. The social structure of frontier communities also contributed to the cycle of violence. In established communities back east, young men were surrounded by family members, church leaders, and community elders who could provide guidance and restraint. On the frontier, many men were far from these influences, living in communities of strangers where the only law was what they could enforce themselves. Without the social bonds that normally prevented conflicts from escalating to violence, disputes that might have been resolved peacefully in other settings became matters of life and death. The role of alcohol in frontier violence cannot be overstated. Whiskey was often safer to drink than water, cheaper than other beverages, and provided one of the few reliable forms of entertainment available in frontier towns. But it also lowered inhibitions, impaired judgment, and made armed men more likely to settle disputes with violence. Many gunfights began as simple disagreements that escalated when one or both parties had been drinking. The combination of alcohol, weapons, and wounded pride proved deadly time and again across the American frontier. The weapons themselves were part of the problem. Unlike modern firearms, which require extensive training to use effectively, the single-action revolvers of the frontier era were relatively simple to operate, but difficult to shoot accurately under stress. This meant that many gunfights involved multiple shots fired at close range, with innocent bystanders at constant risk of being hit by stray bullets. The low accuracy of these weapons under combat conditions also meant that many wounded men died slowly and painfully, lacking access to medical care that might have saved their lives. The aftermath of the Hardin-Taylor gunfight would be typical of hundreds of similar encounters across the frontier. There would be an inquest, presided over by a local official who might have witnessed the shooting himself. Testimony would be taken from available witnesses, though their accounts would often conflict, depending on their relationship to the participants and their own interpretation of events. A verdict would be reached, usually justifying the actions of the survivor, and life would continue as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. something that would ripple outward through time like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Another chapter in the violent story of the American frontier had been written in blood and gunpowder. Another legend had been born. Another life had been lost. Another community had been reminded of the thin line between civilization and chaos. The gunfight was over, but its consequences would echo through the years, shaping the lives of people who hadn't even been born when the shots were fired. As night fell over Dodge City that July evening, the saloons filled with men discussing what they had seen and what it meant for the future of their community. Some argued that the shooting proved the need for stronger law enforcement and stricter gun control. Others insisted that an armed citizenry was the only real protection against outlaws and criminals. The same debates that would rage across America for generations to come were already being fought in the smoky rooms where men gathered to drink and forget the violence they had witnessed during the day. In the quiet moments between the arguments and the drinking, between the bravado and the fear, thoughtful men might have wondered if there was another way. If communities could be built without violence, if disputes could be settled without bloodshed, if young men could find meaning and purpose without strapping on guns and setting out to make reputations for themselves. These were dangerous thoughts in a world where weakness was often rewarded with death, but they were the seeds of the civilization that would eventually replace the violent frontier. The wind that carried the sounds of celebration and mourning through the streets of Dodge City that night would eventually carry other sounds as well. The whistle of trains bringing families and businesses to the frontier. The ring of church bells calling communities to worship and reflection. The laughter of children playing in streets that were finally safe. The violence would not end immediately, but it would gradually give way to something better, something more hopeful, something more worthy of the price that had been paid to create it. And in that transformation from frontier violence to frontier civilization, the gunfight between John Wesley Hardin and Sheriff Jim Taylor would take its place as one small chapter in a larger story. A story of a nation growing up, of communities learning to live together, of individuals choosing cooperation over conflict. It was a story written in blood and sacrifice, but it was also a story of hope, of the possibility that humanity could learn from its mistakes and build something better from the ashes of what had come before. The gunfighters would be remembered, but the civilization they helped create, through their violence and despite it, would be their true and lasting legacy. The morning after Sheriff Taylor killed John Wesley Hardin, the sun rose on a changed world. Word traveled fast in the interconnected web of frontier towns, carried by telegraph operators, traveling salesmen, and cowboys riding the cattle trails. By noon, every saloon from Abilene to Tombstone would know that one of the most feared gunfighters in the West was dead. But what they wouldn't understand was how different the reality had been from their expectations. You see, the mythology of the gunfighter was already taking root, even as real gunfighters were dying in the dust of main streets across the frontier. Dime novels published back east were creating a fantasy version of the West, where brave lawmen faced down evil outlaws in fair fights, where justice always prevailed, and where heroes never had to look over their shoulders or sleep with one eye open. But the men who actually lived this life knew better. Take Wild Bill Hickok, perhaps the most famous gunfighter of his era. The newspapers called him a hero, a man who cleaned up towns with nothing but his courage and his twin Colt Navy revolvers. But the truth was more complicated. Hickok had been a gambler, a sometimes lawman, and a showman who understood the value of reputation. He'd killed perhaps 10 men in his lifetime, but only a few of those deaths resembled anything like a fair fight. In July 1865, Hickok had faced off against Davis Tutt in Springfield, Missouri, in what would become one of the most famous gunfights in Western history. But even that encounter, which came closer than most to the Hollywood ideal, started over a gambling debt and wounded pride. The two men had drawn simultaneously at about 75 yards, an impossibly long distance for accurate pistol shooting. Hickok's bullet found its mark. Tut's went wide. Both men had been lucky and unlucky in equal measure. What made that fight unusual wasn't the skill involved, but the fact that it happened in the open at all. Most gunfights were ambushes, close-range affairs settled in saloons, hotel rooms, or dark alleys. The participants weren't noble warriors testing their mettle against worthy opponents. They were scared, angry, often drunk men who had reached a point where killing seemed like the only solution to their problems. The weapons themselves tell us something about the reality of frontier violence. While Hollywood loves to show gunfighters with matched pairs of Colt 45s, the truth is that most men carried whatever guns they could afford. A typical cowboy might own a beat-up Army Colt, converted from cap and ball to cartridge, or a cheap copy made by one of Colt's competitors. These guns were tools, not symbols of masculinity or honor. Ammunition was expensive and often unreliable. Black powder cartridges could misfire, fail to fire, or simply lack enough power to be effective at any real distance. Many gunfights were decided not by who was faster or more accurate, but by whose gun actually functioned when the moment came. There's nothing romantic about pulling the trigger on a dud cartridge while your opponent's weapon fires true. The physical reality of gunshot wounds was another aspect that popular culture chose to ignore. A bullet from a .44 or .45 caliber revolver could shatter bone, tear massive holes in flesh, and cause bleeding that was impossible to stop with the medical knowledge available on the frontier. Men didn't collapse dramatically and die with poetic last words. They screamed, bled, and often lingered for hours or days before finally succumbing to their wounds. Dr. George Goodfellow, who practiced medicine in Tombstone during its wildest years, became something of an expert on gunshot wounds. He treated victims of the famous gunfight at the OK Corral and dozens of less celebrated shootings. His notes reveal the brutal truth about frontier violence. Men died slowly and in agony. They begged for water, called for their mothers, and sometimes lived long enough to dictate final letters that would never reach their intended recipients. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral itself illustrates how different reality was from legend. On October 26, 1881, the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday faced the Clanton and McClory families in what was essentially a political dispute that had escalated beyond all reason. The fight lasted about 30 seconds. 30 shots were fired at close range. 3 men died, and 3 others were wounded. It was chaos, not choreography. Wyatt Earp, who became perhaps the most famous of the participants, wasn't even the primary lawman involved. That was his brother Virgil, who was serving as Tombstone's chief of police. Wyatt was a deputy, brought along to help arrest men who had been threatening violence for weeks. But it was Wyatt who would become the legend, partly because he lived longer than the others, and partly because he was better at telling his own story. The aftermath of the OK Corral gunfight shows us another truth about frontier justice. The shooting didn't end the conflict. It escalated it. 3 months later, Virgil Earp was ambushed and permanently crippled by shotgun blasts. 2 months after that, Morgan Earp was assassinated while playing billiards. Wyatt responded by hunting down and killing the men he believed responsible, actions that forced him to flee Arizona as a wanted man. This cycle of violence was typical of the real Wild West. One gunfight led to another, as friends and family members sought revenge for the fallen. Communities were torn apart by feuds that sometimes lasted for decades. The idea that a single dramatic confrontation could settle disputes and restore order was pure fantasy. In reality, violence bred more violence, until entire regions were consumed by it. Consider the Lincoln County War in New Mexico, which raged from 1878 to 1881 and made Billy the Kid famous. What started as a dispute between rival business factions became a shooting war that claimed dozens of lives and paralyzed an entire county. Billy the Kid wasn't a noble outlaw fighting for justice. He was a young man caught up in a conflict he probably didn't fully understand, killing to stay alive in a situation where neutrality meant death. The real Billy the Kid was born Henry McCarty, probably in New York City, and he came west with his mother when he was still a child. He was small, maybe 5'7" and 140 pounds, with prominent front teeth and a high-pitched voice. He didn't look like a deadly gunfighter. He looked like what he was, a poor kid from a broken family who had been forced to grow up too fast in a violent world. Billy probably killed 4 men during the Lincoln County War, not the 21 claimed by the dime novels. His first killing was likely in self-defense. His second was during a battle where dozens of men were shooting at each other, and his third and fourth were executions of men who had betrayed him to his enemies. None of these deaths resembled the quick-draw duels of popular fiction. They were desperate acts by a desperate young man who knew that his enemies would show him no mercy if he fell into their hands. The weapons favored by real gunfighters also differed from popular imagination. While the Colt single-action Army revolver became iconic, many gunfighters preferred shotguns or rifles when they had a choice. Doc Holliday carried a shotgun to the OK Corral. Wild Bill Hickok often favored rifles for serious work. Shotguns were devastating at close range and didn't require the precision shooting that handguns demanded under stress. The famous fast draw was mostly a Hollywood invention. Real gunfighters were more concerned with accuracy than speed, and they often drew their weapons before the shooting started, not during some elaborate ritual. Many gunfights began with one or both participants already holding their guns, having drawn them when they sensed trouble brewing. The idea of keeping your gun holstered until the last possible second would have seemed like suicide to anyone who actually depended on their weapon for survival. Training with firearms was also different from what movies suggest. Ammunition was expensive, so most men didn't practice regularly. They learned to shoot by hunting for food or defending themselves from hostile Indians or bandits. Their shooting was practical, but not necessarily precise. A man might be deadly accurate at 15 feet, but unable to hit a target at 50 yards. Distance shooting with handguns was a skill few possessed, and fewer still had reason to develop. The psychological toll of constant violence was enormous, but rarely discussed. Men who lived by the gun often died young, not just from gunshot wounds, but from the stress of constantly watching their backs. They drank heavily, slept poorly, and developed what we might now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Some became increasingly paranoid and trigger-happy. Others simply burned out, abandoning the violent life before it consumed them entirely. John Wesley Hardin, before his death in Dodge City that July day, had written in his autobiography about the burden of his reputation. Every young gunfighter wanted to make his name by killing the famous John Wesley Hardin. Every lawman wanted to be the one who brought him to justice. He couldn't walk into a saloon without wondering which of the men at the bar might be planning to put a bullet in his back. Fame, in the world of the gunfighter, was often a death sentence delivered slowly. The towns themselves were complicit in the violence. Places like Dodge City, Abilene, and Deadwood depended on the cattle trade and mining boom for their prosperity. These industries brought together thousands of young men with money in their pockets, weapons on their hips, and few outlets for entertainment beyond drinking, gambling, and fighting. Town councils hired gunfighters as lawmen not to eliminate violence, but to control it and keep it from driving away legitimate business. The economic reality behind frontier gunfighting was rarely romantic. Most gunfighters were essentially hired guns, working for cattle barons, mining companies, or political factions. They killed for money, not honor. The famous range wars between cattlemen and homesteaders were fought by professionals who understood that violence was just another business tool, like branding irons or barbed wire. Women in the West often understood this reality better than the men who perpetuated it. They saw the widows left behind, the children orphaned by senseless violence, the communities torn apart by feuds that served no purpose beyond masculine pride. Some women, like Belle Starr and Calamity Jane, participated in the violent culture themselves, but most simply endured it, knowing that their survival often depended on the very men whose violence they deplored. The arrival of the railroad changed everything. It brought law and order in the form of federal marshals, professional police forces, and courts that actually functioned. More importantly, it brought economic opportunities that made gunfighting seem like an anachronism. Men who might have become notorious gunfighters instead became shopkeepers, railroad workers, or ranchers. The wild frontier was being tamed not by brave lawmen, but by commerce and civilization. By the 1880s, the era of the gunfighter was essentially over. The last great gunfights were already becoming the stuff of legend, embellished with each retelling until the truth was buried beneath layers of myth and marketing. The men who had lived through the real violence often found themselves cast as characters in someone else's story, expected to play roles that bore little resemblance to their actual experiences. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the saloons fell silent and the streets emptied, the old gunfighters would sometimes gather to share their real stories. Not the ones they told to reporters or biographers, but the truth about what it felt like to kill a man, to watch the light fade from someone's eyes, to carry the weight of violence that could never be undone. These conversations happened in whispers, between men who understood that some truths were too dark for the world to hear. They would remember the smell of gunpowder mixing with blood, the way a man's body convulsed when a bullet found its mark, the sounds that dying men made when they thought no one was listening. They would remember the families they had destroyed, the children who would grow up without fathers, the women who would never stop mourning their dead. These were the real costs of the gunfighter's life, payments that came due long after the smoke had cleared and the crowds had gone home. And sometimes, in those quiet moments, they would wonder if any of it had been worth it. The fame, the fear, the money, the power over life and death. Most concluded that it hadn't been. They had traded their humanity for a reputation that would outlive them, but never truly capture who they had been. They were remembered as legends, but they had lived as men, with all the frailty and failure that humanity entails. As the frontier closed and the West became just another part of America, the gunfighters faced a choice. They could adapt to the new reality, finding honest work in a world that no longer had room for their particular skills. Or they could cling to the past, becoming parodies of themselves, performing in Wild West shows or telling tall tales to tourists who wanted to believe in the mythology they had helped create. Either path led away from the truth, toward a future where the real story of the gunfighter would be lost forever beneath the weight of legend. The night wind that had once carried the sounds of gunfire and dying men across the endless plains now whispered through peaceful streets where children played and families gathered for supper. The Wild West was dying, not in a blaze of gunfire, but with the quiet dignity of a dream that had served its purpose and was ready to become memory. The gunfighters who had defined an era were becoming ghosts, haunting a landscape that was rapidly leaving them behind. The transformation was visible in the architecture itself. The false-fronted buildings that had given frontier towns their distinctive appearance were being replaced by solid brick structures built to last for generations rather than just the next cattle season. Banks installed steel vaults instead of relying on armed guards. Hotels began advertising their safety and respectability rather than their proximity to the red light districts that had once been the center of frontier social life. Churches multiplied across the landscape, their steeples rising above the saloons that had once dominated frontier skylines. These weren't the rough-hewn meeting houses of the early pioneer days, but substantial buildings that spoke of permanent communities with stable populations and long-term plans. The ministers who preached in these churches often spoke about redemption and second chances. messages that resonated with former gunfighters and outlaws who were trying to build new lives in the changing West. Schools followed close behind the churches, bringing with them teachers who had been trained in Eastern colleges and carried with them ideas about education, citizenship, and social progress that were foreign to the violent culture of the frontier. These teachers, many of them young women who had never seen a gun fired in anger, began the slow work of civilizing a generation of children who had grown up thinking that violence was a normal way to solve problems. The economic transformation was equally dramatic. The cattle drives that had brought thousands of young cowboys to frontier towns were being replaced by railroad shipping that required only a handful of workers to move the same number of animals. The mining camps that had sprouted overnight around gold and silver strikes were being replaced by corporate operations that valued predictability and safety over quick profits. The demand for men who could handle violence was declining as rapidly as the demand for men who could handle business was increasing. Professional criminals found themselves in an increasingly hostile environment. The Pinkerton Detective Agency had established a network of operatives across the West, sharing information about wanted men and coordinating manhunts across state and territorial boundaries. Photographic equipment had become portable enough for field use, meaning that wanted posters could show actual faces rather than artistic interpretations. The anonymity that had protected many outlaws was disappearing, along with the frontier itself. The legal system was evolving as well. Territorial courts were being replaced by state courts, with professional judges and established procedures. Juries were increasingly composed of settled family men rather than transient cowboys and miners, who might sympathize with defendants who had lived similar lives. The informal justice of the frontier, where a man's reputation might carry more weight than physical evidence, was giving way to a more systematic approach to law enforcement that left little room for romantic notions about noble outlaws. Communication technology played a crucial role in the transformation. Telegraph lines connected even remote towns to the broader world, allowing news of crimes and criminals to travel faster than the perpetrators themselves could flee. Railroad networks made it possible for federal marshals and detective agencies to coordinate their efforts across vast distances. The isolation that had protected many outlaws was ending as the infrastructure of modern civilization reached into the most remote corners of the frontier. The psychological impact of these changes was profound for the men who had built their identities around their skill with weapons and their willingness to use violence. Many found themselves adrift in a world that no longer valued their particular talents. Some adapted by becoming lawmen themselves, using their knowledge of criminal behavior to track down men who lived as they once had. Others found work as security guards for banks and transportation companies, trading their independence for steady wages and social respectability. A few tried to maintain their old lifestyle by moving to more remote areas where the law was still weak and opportunities for violence still existed. But even these refuges were temporary. The frontier was closing from all directions, and there were fewer and fewer places where a man could live by his gun without eventually facing the consequences. The most successful former gunfighters were those who recognized the changing times and adapted their skills to new circumstances. Women played a significant role in this transformation, though their contribution was often overlooked by historians who focused on the dramatic conflicts between men. Frontier women had always been among the strongest advocates for law and order, having seen firsthand the costs of violence to families and communities. As they gained political influence through organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they pushed for reforms that would make their communities safer for children and families. The temperance movement in particular targeted one of the root causes of frontier violence by attempting to limit access to alcohol. While prohibition wouldn't become national policy for several decades, many frontier towns began restricting the hours and locations where liquor could be sold. These measures reduced the number of alcohol-fueled confrontations that had been responsible for many gunfights and killings. Educational initiatives also played a role in reducing violence. As literacy rates increased and newspapers became more common, people had access to information about the outside world and alternative ways of resolving conflicts. The romantic mythology surrounding gunfighters began to compete with more practical ideas about success and social advancement that emphasized education, business skills, and community involvement over individual prowess with weapons. The military also contributed to the pacification of the frontier. The Indian Wars, which had provided a career path for many men who enjoyed violence and adventure, were winding down as Native American resistance was finally crushed. Veterans of these conflicts found themselves with skills that were no longer needed and a taste for excitement that civilian life couldn't satisfy. Some became lawmen or private detectives, but many struggled to adapt to peacetime occupations that seemed tame and unrewarding compared to their military experiences. Medical advances also played a role in reducing frontier violence. As trained doctors became more common in Western towns, the survival rate for gunshot victims increased significantly. This meant that non-fatal shootings, which had often led to death from infection or blood loss, were more likely to result in recovery. The knowledge that shooting someone didn't necessarily mean killing them may have made some men more willing to use their weapons, but it also meant that the stakes of gun violence were somewhat lower than they had been in the early days of the frontier. Banking and financial institutions brought their own form of civilization to the frontier. As credit became more widely available and business transactions could be conducted through established financial channels, the cash-based economy that had made robbery so profitable began to disappear. Money could be transferred by telegraph and stored in vaults that were virtually impregnable. The opportunities for quick wealth through violence were declining as rapidly as the opportunities for honest prosperity were increasing. Insurance companies also played a role in the transformation. As they began offering policies to protect businesses and property in frontier towns, they insisted on certain safety measures and security precautions. Towns that wanted to attract investment and development found themselves under pressure to reduce crime rates and eliminate the violence that made them poor insurance risks. Economic incentives were accomplishing what moral arguments and legal penalties had often failed to achieve. The entertainment industry that grew up around frontier themes also contributed to the mythology that replaced historical reality. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show toured the country and even Europe, presenting a romanticized version of frontier life that emphasized adventure and heroism while minimizing the brutal reality of frontier violence. These shows were enormously popular with urban audiences who had never experienced frontier life and wanted to believe in a more exciting and heroic version of American history. Dime novels continued to proliferate, creating fictional gunfighters and outlaws who were far more noble and heroic than their real-life counterparts. These stories provided a safe way for people to experience the excitement of frontier violence without any of the actual danger or moral complexity. They also created expectations about how gunfighters should behave that were completely divorced from the reality of frontier violence. Photography played a crucial role in both documenting and mythologizing the end of the frontier era. Photographers like John Grable and L.A. Huffman captured images of the last cattle drives, the final Indian campaigns, and the growing towns that were replacing the rough settlements of earlier years. These photographs provided a visual record of the transformation, but they were also carefully composed to emphasize certain aspects of frontier life while ignoring others. The images that survived often showed gunfighters and outlaws as dignified figures who looked more like successful businessmen than desperate criminals. The reality of violence, with its blood and terror and human suffering, was largely absent from these carefully posed portraits. They contributed to the mythology by presenting a sanitized version of frontier life that was easier to admire than the brutal reality would have been. As the 19th century drew to a close, the last of the great gunfighters were dying off or disappearing into obscurity. The skills that had made them famous were becoming obsolete, replaced by new technologies and social structures that made individual violence both unnecessary and counterproductive. The frontier they had known was becoming a memory, preserved in stories and photographs, but no longer a living reality that shaped daily life for millions of Americans. The generation that had grown up during the height of frontier violence began to age into positions of leadership in their communities. These men and women understood the costs of lawlessness and were determined to build something better for their children. They supported education, law enforcement, and social institutions that would make violence unnecessary. They had seen enough gunfighters and outlaws for one lifetime, and they wanted their communities to attract families, businesses, and respectable citizens instead. The transformation was not always smooth or complete. Some frontier towns struggled for decades to overcome their violent reputations and attract the kind of development that would ensure long-term prosperity. Others never made the transition successfully and gradually declined as the industries that had created them moved elsewhere or became obsolete. But across the West, the general trend was clear. The age of the gunfighter was ending, replaced by an age of farmers, merchants, and families who valued stability over excitement and prosperity over adventure. In the end, the gunfighters had played a necessary role in the development of the American West, even if it wasn't the heroic role that later mythology would assign to them. They had provided a form of rough justice in places where no other justice existed. They had protected some communities while terrorizing others. They had created the conditions that made peaceful development possible, even as they often opposed that development when it threatened their way of life. They were the violent midwives of American civilization, helping to birth a new society through the very brutality that would eventually have no place in it. The saloons of the Old West tell their own story about the nature of frontier violence. And it's a story written in bloodstains that no amount of sawdust could completely absorb. These establishments weren't just places where men drank and gambled. They were theaters of violence, where the drama of the gunfighter played out its final acts, away from the romantic Main Street showdowns of popular imagination. Picture the Long Branch Saloon in Dodge City on any given Saturday night in 1876. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the stench of unwashed bodies, spilled whiskey, and the fear that always seemed to hang around places where armed men gathered to test their luck. The wooden floors creaked under the weight of cowboys, drifters, gamblers, and the occasional respectable citizen who had wandered in seeking excitement or simply trying to conduct business in the only place that stayed open past dark. The lighting came from oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across the room, making every face look sinister and every movement seem threatening. Card games progressed in corners, where men hunched over their hands, watching each other for signs of cheating while keeping one ear tuned to the conversations around them. You never knew when someone might mention your name, your past, or your enemies. Information was currency in places like this, and the wrong word in the wrong ear could end your life before you finished your drink. It was in places like the Long Branch that most real gunfights actually happened. Not in the street at high noon, but across a poker table when someone was caught dealing seconds. Not in a formal duel, but when a drunk cowboy decided that the man beside him was looking at him wrong. Not with honor and ceremony, but with sudden, explosive violence that erupted without warning and ended with bodies cooling in the sawdust. Luke Short, one of the most successful gamblers and gunfighters of the era, understood this reality better than most. He was a small man, barely 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighing less than 140 pounds. He didn't look dangerous, which was exactly the point. In a world where reputation could make you a target, anonymity was often the key to survival. Short carried a custom-made Colt with the barrel shortened for easier concealment, and he had killed at least 5 men in gunfights that lasted less than 3 seconds each. Short's method was simple and effective. He would position himself at a card table with his back to the wall and a clear view of all the entrances. When trouble started, he wouldn't wait for his opponent to draw first. He would simply reach across his body, draw his weapon, and fire before the other man realized the fight had begun. There was nothing fair about it, nothing honorable, and nothing that resembled the gunfights of popular fiction. It was simply efficient killing by a man who understood that dead heroes were still dead. The most famous saloon gunfight in Western history illustrates just how different reality was from myth. On August 2, 1876, Wild Bill Hickok was playing poker at Nuttall and Mann's Saloon in Deadwood, Dakota Territory. For the first time in years, he was sitting with his back to the door, a violation of his own survival rules that would cost him his life. Jack McCall, a drifter with a grudge against Hickok, walked up behind the famous gunfighter and shot him in the back of the head with a .45 caliber revolver. Hickok died instantly, slumping forward onto the table and scattering his cards across the floor. He had been holding 2 black aces and 2 black eights, a combination that would forever be known as the dead man's hand. But there was nothing poetic about his death. It was an assassination, pure and simple, carried out by a man who knew he couldn't face Hickok in any kind of fair fight. McCall walked out of the saloon unopposed, and would have escaped entirely if he hadn't been drunk enough to brag about what he'd done. This was how most famous gunfighters actually died, not in blazes of glory, but through treachery, ambush, or simple bad luck. Jesse James was shot in the back by a member of his own gang. Billy the Kid was killed in a dark room by Pat Garrett, who fired without warning. John Wesley Hardin was murdered while playing dice, shot by a man he had never seen before. The romantic ideal of the gunfighter dying with his boots on in a fair fight was mostly fantasy. The weapons used in saloon gunfights were often different from those carried for street work. Many gamblers favored derringers, small pistols that could be concealed in a vest pocket or up a sleeve. These weapons were accurate only at very close range, but in the confined space of a saloon, close range was all you had. A gambler might carry a derringer in each hand, ready to fire both barrels before his opponent could draw a larger weapon. The famous ivory-handled revolvers beloved by Hollywood were actually rare and impractical. Ivory was slippery when wet, either from sweat or blood, and expensive guns marked their owners as targets for robbery. Most working gunfighters carried plain, functional weapons with wooden grips that provided a secure hold under stress. They cared more about reliability than appearance, because a gun that misfired was worse than no gun at all. The psychology of saloon violence was complex and often irrational. Men who had been drinking for hours would fixate on imagined insults or perceived slights. A spilled drink could become grounds for murder. A casual comment about someone's hometown, their horse, or their choice of cards could escalate into deadly violence within seconds. Alcohol didn't just lower inhibitions. It created situations where armed men convinced themselves that their honor demanded bloodshed. Clay Allison, known as the gentleman gunfighter, was famous for his unpredictable behavior when drunk. He once rode his horse through a saloon, firing his guns at the ceiling and demanding that everyone buy him a drink. Another time, he challenged the local dentist to a gunfight because he didn't like the way the man had filled his tooth. Allison killed at least 15 men, most of them in saloon brawls, that started over trivial disputes that sober men would have laughed off. The role of women in saloon gunfights was often overlooked by later historians, but it was significant. Prostitutes, dance hall girls, and female gamblers were frequently the catalysts for violence. Men fought over them, for them, and sometimes against them. These women learned to read the signs of impending violence and developed their own survival strategies. Some carried their own weapons. Others formed alliances with dangerous men who would protect them. A few became deadly in their own right. Poker Alice Ivers was a professional gambler who worked the saloons of Colorado and South Dakota for 40 years. She carried a .38 revolver and wasn't afraid to use it. When a drunk cowboy accused her of cheating and reached for his gun, Alice shot him through the heart before he cleared leather. She continued dealing cards while his body was dragged away, calmly explaining to the other players that she never cheated at cards, but would certainly cheat death when the situation required it. The aftermath of saloon gunfights was often more chaotic than the violence itself. Unlike street fights, which usually had witnesses on both sides, saloon shootings happened in confined spaces where everyone had been drinking and the lighting was poor. Determining what had actually happened, who had fired first, and whether the killing was justified often proved impossible. Justice in these cases was frequently decided by whoever told the most convincing story, not by who had actually been in the right. The cleanup after a saloon killing was a grim business that reveals much about frontier attitudes toward death. Bodies were dragged outside and left in the street until the undertaker could be summoned. Blood was soaked up with sawdust and swept away, but the stains lingered in the wooden floors, creating dark patches that marked the spots where men had died. Customers would return the next night to drink and gamble around these reminders of mortality, treating violent death as simply another part of frontier life. Some saloons became known for their body count. The Oriental in Tombstone saw so many killings that locals joked about the need for a revolving door to the morgue. The Bull's Head in Abilene had a reputation for violence that kept respectable citizens away and attracted the kind of men who thrived on danger. These establishments wore their violent history like a badge of honor, understanding that a certain amount of bloodshed was good for business. The economics of frontier violence extended to the saloons themselves. A good gunfight brought customers who wanted to see where it had happened, to drink at the same bar where famous killers had stood, to sit at the same tables where men had died. Bullet holes in walls and mirrors were preserved rather than repaired. Bloodstains were pointed out to visitors. Death became a tourist attraction in towns that had little else to offer the outside world. But for the men who actually lived through these shootings, the experience was far from entertaining. Survivors often suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about the men they had killed. They jumped at sudden sounds. They developed drinking problems that made them even more dangerous in future encounters. The cycle of violence fed on itself, creating men who killed because they had killed before and saw no other way to resolve conflicts. Doc Holliday was perhaps the most famous example of a man consumed by the violent culture he had helped create. A dentist by training and a gambler by choice, Holliday had tuberculosis and knew he was dying. This knowledge freed him from the normal constraints that kept men from seeking out violent confrontations. He killed at least 6 men in saloon gunfights, not because he had to, but because he no longer cared whether he lived or died. Holliday's partnership with Wyatt Earp was based on mutual need rather than friendship. Earp needed someone who wasn't afraid to kill, and Holliday needed someone who could provide a veneer of legal respectability for his violent impulses. Together, they carved out a reputation for deadly efficiency that served both their purposes, but ultimately consumed them. Holliday died of his disease in a Colorado sanitarium, having outlived most of his enemies, but never found the peace he claimed not to want. The decline of saloon violence came gradually, as frontier towns grew large enough to support professional police forces and court systems that actually functioned. Business leaders realized that constant gunfights were bad for commerce, driving away investment and keeping respectable families from settling in their communities. Violence was channeled into organized activities, like boxing matches and rodeos, where men could test themselves against each other without the risk of death. By the 1890s, the great age of the saloon gunfight was ending. The most famous practitioners were either dead or had moved on to other occupations. The weapons had become more reliable and more deadly, but paradoxically, this made them less likely to be used. When everyone knew that pulling a gun meant certain death for someone, fewer men were willing to let their disputes reach that point. The threat of violence replaced actual violence as the primary tool of conflict resolution. But the stories lived on, growing more elaborate with each telling. Saloon fights that had lasted 3 seconds became epic confrontations. Men who had shot their opponents in the back became heroes who had faced down their enemies in fair combat. The sawdust-floored, blood-stained reality of frontier violence was transformed into something cleaner, nobler, and ultimately more palatable to a nation that wanted to believe its Western expansion had been guided by honor rather than greed and brutality. The old saloons themselves gradually disappeared, replaced by more respectable establishments that served families rather than just single men with guns and grudges. The bullet holes were plastered over, the bloodstains scrubbed away, the memories of violence deliberately forgotten in favor of a sanitized version of the past that emphasized progress and civilization over the darker truths of frontier life. Yet something of the spirit of those violent years lingered in the spaces where the old saloons had stood. Local residents would sometimes claim to hear the sound of gunshots on quiet nights, or see shadowy figures moving through empty buildings where famous gunfighters had once held court. Whether these were actual hauntings or simply the power of suggestion, they spoke to a deeper truth about the nature of violence and memory in the American West. The men who had lived and died in those saloon gunfights became ghosts in more than one sense. Their names were remembered, but their humanity was lost. They were transformed from complex individuals with fears, hopes, and regrets into cartoon characters who existed solely to kill or be killed. The real stories of their lives, the circumstances that had driven them to violence, and the costs they had paid for their choices were buried beneath layers of myth and legend. As the night settles over the empty lots where the great frontier saloons once stood, you can almost hear the echoes of those long-ago confrontations. The clink of glasses, the shuffle of cards, the scrape of boot heels on wooden floors. And underneath it all, the whispered conversations of men who knew that tomorrow might bring their last sunrise, that the next hand of cards might be their final game, that the next argument might be their last. These were the real sounds of the Wild West, not the dramatic music of Hollywood, but the quiet desperation of mortal men playing for the highest stakes of all. In the end, the saloon gunfights of the Old West tell us as much about ourselves as they do about the men who fought them. We want to believe in heroes and villains, in clear distinctions between right and wrong, in violence that serves justice rather than selfish ends. The reality was messier, more complicated, and ultimately more human than the stories we prefer to tell. But perhaps that's why these stories matter. They remind us that behind every legend is a person, and behind every person is a choice between the easy path of violence and the harder road of finding another way. The preservation of these stories required the work of countless individuals who understood that history is lost when no one bothers to record it. Newspaper editors who risked their lives reporting on violent events. Court clerks who carefully documented testimony and evidence. Family members who preserved letters and photographs. Local historians who interviewed aging survivors and recorded their memories before death claimed them. Without their efforts, the reality of frontier violence would have been completely overwhelmed by the mythology that replaced it. Archaeological evidence from saloon sites across the West tells its own story about frontier violence. Excavations have revealed bullet holes in walls that had been plastered over, bloodstains in wooden floors that had been covered with new planking, and artifacts that speak to the reality of life and death in these establishments. Broken glasses, scattered coins, personal effects left behind by men who died too quickly to collect their belongings. These silent witnesses to violence provide a physical reality that no amount of mythology can erase. The medical records that survived from frontier hospitals and doctors' offices provide another window into the reality of saloon violence. Dr. Richard Buck, who practiced medicine in several frontier towns during the 1870s, kept detailed notes on the gunshot wounds he treated. His observations reveal the brutal effectiveness of close-range revolver fire, the frequent complications from infection and blood loss, and the high mortality rate among men who survived the initial shooting, only to die days or weeks later from their wounds. The economic impact of saloon violence extended far beyond the immediate participants. Insurance companies began refusing to write policies for businesses in towns with high rates of violent crime. Freight companies charged higher rates to deliver goods to areas they considered dangerous. Professional people, including doctors, lawyers, and teachers, often chose to settle in more peaceful communities where they felt their families would be safe. This brain drain left many frontier towns dependent on industries that attracted the very people most likely to engage in violence. The social costs were equally significant. Children who grew up witnessing routine violence often developed behavioral problems that persisted into adulthood. Women who lost husbands or sons to saloon gunfights frequently faced poverty and social isolation. Entire families sometimes left towns where violence had claimed loved ones, taking their skills and resources with them. The cycle of violence fed on itself, creating communities that attracted people who had few other options while driving away those who might have helped build something better. Religious institutions played a complex role in the phenomenon of saloon violence. Many frontier ministers preached against alcohol and gambling, understanding that these activities often led to the conflicts that erupted in gunfire. But they also provided the only organized opposition to the culture of violence that dominated many frontier communities. Churches offered alternative social activities, spaces for peaceful community gatherings, and moral frameworks that challenged the idea that violence was an acceptable way to resolve disputes. The role of alcohol in saloon violence cannot be overstated. Frontier whiskey was often poorly made, containing impurities and additives that increased its intoxicating effects while making hangovers more severe. Men who had been drinking for hours in hot, crowded saloons often found their judgment severely impaired and their tempers shortened. What might have been minor disagreements between sober men became deadly conflicts when alcohol was involved. The combination of firearms and alcohol proved lethal time and again across the frontier. Gambling culture also contributed significantly to saloon violence. The card games that were central to saloon life involved not just money, but reputation and masculine pride. Being caught cheating was considered grounds for immediate violence, but accusations of cheating were also common when men were losing money they couldn't afford to lose. The high stakes and loose rules created an environment where disputes were frequent and deadly force was often seen as the only way to settle them. The weapons technology of the era shaped the nature of saloon violence in important ways. Single-action revolvers required deliberate effort to fire, with the hammer having to be cocked for each shot. This meant that saloon gunfights often involved rapid sequences of deliberate shots, rather than the rapid-fire exchanges depicted in later films. The large calibers of frontier revolvers also meant that wounds were usually severe, with survival often depending more on the location of the wound than on the quality of medical care available. The physical design of frontier saloons influenced how violence played out within them. Long, narrow rooms with the bar along one wall created natural choke points where men could be trapped with no room to maneuver. Low ceilings and poor lighting made it difficult to see clearly, leading to mistaken identities and accidents that escalated into deadly confrontations. The sawdust on the floors, originally intended to absorb spilled drinks, often ended up absorbing blood instead. Social hierarchies within saloon culture also contributed to violence. Professional gamblers, cattle barons, and successful businessmen often demanded deference from cowboys, drifters, and working men. When this deference wasn't forthcoming, or when alcohol broke down normal social barriers, conflicts could escalate quickly. Class tensions, racial prejudices, and regional rivalries all found expression in saloon confrontations that might have been avoided in more structured social settings. The seasonal nature of frontier work created particular conditions that contributed to saloon violence. Cowboys who had spent months on cattle drives with limited human contact often binged on alcohol and social interaction when they reached town. Miners who had been isolated in remote camps behaved similarly when they came to town to spend their earnings. These periodic influxes of young men with money to spend and frustrations to release created predictable cycles of violence that saloon owners learned to anticipate and sometimes exploit. Legal responses to saloon violence varied widely across the frontier. Some towns banned firearms within city limits, but these laws were difficult to enforce and often ignored. Others tried to regulate saloons by limiting their hours, requiring licenses, or banning certain activities like gambling. A few communities attempted prohibition, but this usually drove drinking underground rather than eliminating it. The most effective responses often involved improving general law enforcement and creating alternative entertainment options that didn't involve alcohol. The cultural legacy of saloon violence extended far beyond the frontier itself. The image of the saloon as a place where men settled their differences with guns became a defining element of American mythology about the West. This mythology influenced everything from literature and films to political rhetoric about individualism and self-reliance. The reality of saloon violence, with its senseless waste of human life and destruction of communities, was largely forgotten in favor of more romantic interpretations that emphasized courage and honor over desperation and brutality. Modern historians have worked to reconstruct the reality of saloon violence by examining court records, newspaper accounts, and personal diaries from the frontier era. Their research reveals a pattern of violence that was more random and meaningless than the mythology suggests. Most saloon gunfights began over trivial disputes and ended with the death of young men who had barely begun their adult lives. The romantic image of seasoned gunfighters facing each other in dramatic confrontations was largely fictional, created to satisfy audiences who wanted their violence to have meaning and purpose. The psychological trauma experienced by survivors of saloon violence was rarely acknowledged or treated during the frontier era. Men who had killed in saloon gunfights often suffered from nightmares, depression, and anxiety that would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Some turned to alcohol or opium to cope with their memories, creating additional problems that affected their families and communities. Others simply left town and tried to start over somewhere else, carrying their psychological wounds with them wherever they went. The transformation of saloon culture came gradually as frontier communities matured and developed more sophisticated social structures. Family-oriented entertainment venues began to compete with saloons for customers and community support. Churches and schools provided alternative gathering places that didn't involve alcohol or gambling. Professional associations and fraternal organizations offered men ways to socialize and resolve disputes without resorting to violence. The saloon gradually lost its position as the center of frontier social life, taking much of the associated violence with it. But the memory of saloon violence lingered long after the reality had faded. Stories were told and retold, growing more dramatic with each iteration. Survivors found themselves cast as heroes or villains in tales that bore little resemblance to their actual experiences. The complex social, economic, and psychological factors that had created the conditions for violence were forgotten in favor of simpler narratives about good and evil, courage and cowardice, civilization and barbarism. Today, the sites where frontier saloons once stood are often marked by historical plaques that sanitize their violent history for tourist consumption. The blood has long since been washed away by rain and time. The bullet holes filled and painted over. The memories of terror and suffering buried beneath layers of romantic mythology. But for those willing to look beyond the myths and examine the historical record, the reality of saloon violence remains visible. a reminder of what happens when human beings are stripped of the social structures that normally prevent them from killing each other over trivial disputes. The train robbery changed everything about frontier violence, but not in the way most people imagine. When the first bandits discovered they could stop a locomotive in the middle of nowhere, take what they wanted, and disappear into the vast wilderness, they created a new kind of gunfight. One that happened at 60 miles per hour, in rolling steel boxes, with innocent passengers caught in the crossfire between desperate outlaws and determined lawmen. Jesse James and his gang pioneered this new form of violence on October 6, 1866, when they derailed a Rock Island train near Adair, Iowa. But the reality of train robbery was far from the romantic adventure depicted in later films. The crash killed the engineer and injured dozens of passengers. The bandits made off with only about $3,000, barely enough to split among 8 men after months of planning. It was brutal, dangerous work that usually ended with the robbers dead or in prison. The James gang's success spawned imitators across the West, men who saw train robbery as a path to quick wealth and lasting fame. What they didn't understand was how different this kind of gunfighting was from the saloon brawls and street confrontations that had defined frontier violence until then. Train robbery required careful planning, precise timing, and the willingness to kill strangers who had done nothing wrong except be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch represented the evolution of this new breed of outlaw. They studied railroad schedules, mapped escape routes, and developed sophisticated techniques for stopping trains without derailing them. Their method was elegant in its simplicity. They would block the tracks with logs or boulders, forcing the engineer to stop, then overwhelm the crew with superior firepower before they could organize resistance. But the railroads fought back with their own brand of violence. They hired Pinkerton detectives, former military officers, and gunfighters to protect their trains and hunt down the men who robbed them. These railroad detectives were often more ruthless than the outlaws they pursued. They operated under few legal constraints and enjoyed the support of federal authorities who understood that the nation's economic future depended on safe rail transport. The gunfights that erupted on moving trains created unique challenges that tested even experienced fighters. The rocking motion of the cars made accurate shooting nearly impossible. The narrow corridors between passenger seats provided little room to maneuver. The presence of terrified civilians meant that every shot fired risked killing someone who had no part in the conflict. These were not the clean, simple duels of frontier mythology, but chaotic battles, where victory often went to whoever was lucky enough to survive the crossfire. Harvey Logan, known as Kid Curry, was perhaps the most violent member of the Wild Bunch. He had killed at least 9 men before he turned to train robbery, and he brought that lethal experience to his new profession. During the robbery of a Great Northern train near Wagner, Montana, Logan shot and killed a sheriff who tried to organize passenger resistance. The killing was unnecessary from a tactical standpoint, but it sent a message that would make future passengers less likely to interfere. The psychological warfare of train robbery was as important as the actual violence. Outlaws would fire shots into the air to terrorize passengers into submission, knowing that frightened people were less likely to fight back or remember identifying details later. They wore masks or bandanas, not just to hide their identity, but to dehumanize themselves in the eyes of their victims. It's harder to resist someone whose face you can't see, whose humanity has been deliberately obscured. The weapons used in train robberies reflected the changing nature of frontier warfare. Outlaws began carrying dynamite to blast open express cars and safes. They used Winchester rifles for long-range work and shotguns for close-quarters fighting in the narrow confines of passenger cars. The famous Colt revolvers of earlier gunfighters were relegated to backup weapons, useful only when the primary firearms ran out of ammunition or jammed at critical moments. Charlie Siringo, a former cowboy turned Pinkerton detective, spent years tracking train robbers across the West. His memoirs reveal the cat-and-mouse game that developed between outlaws and the law. Robbers would study the habits of railroad detectives, learning their methods and adapting their own techniques accordingly. Detectives would infiltrate outlaw gangs, sometimes spending months or years undercover to gather intelligence about planned robberies. The most famous train robbery in Western history took place on June 2nd, 1899, when Butch Cassidy and his gang stopped the Union Pacific Overland Flyer near Wilcox, Wyoming. They used too much dynamite to blow open the express car, completely destroying it and scattering money across the countryside. The blast was so powerful that it could be heard for miles, and it killed one of the robbers when flying debris struck him in the head. Even when train robbers succeeded, they often paid a terrible price for their crimes. The pursuit that followed the Wilcox robbery shows how seriously the authorities took train robbery. A massive posse tracked the Wild Bunch across 3 states, eventually cornering them in a remote canyon where a fierce gunfight erupted. 2 outlaws were killed, 3 escaped, and the posse members went home with bullet wounds and the knowledge that they had participated in the end of an era. The days when small gangs could rob trains and disappear into the wilderness were numbered. The technology that made train robbery possible also made it obsolete. Telegraph lines allowed railroad companies to communicate instantly with authorities, coordinating pursuit efforts across vast distances. Improved roads made it easier for large posses to track fugitives. Photography meant that wanted posters could show actual faces rather than artistic interpretations. The same industrial progress that created wealthy targets for outlaws also created the tools that would ultimately destroy them. Blackjack Ketchum learned this lesson the hard way when he attempted to single-handedly rob a Colorado and Southern train near Folsom, New Mexico in 1901. Ketchum had successfully robbed trains before, but times had changed. The conductor was armed and ready for trouble. The express messenger had been trained in combat tactics, and backup was just a telegraph message away. Ketchum was shot in the arm during the robbery attempt, captured while trying to escape, and eventually hanged for his crimes. The end came swiftly for most train robbers. Improved communication and transportation meant that nowhere was safe for very long. The Wild Bunch fled to South America, where some of them died in a shootout with Bolivian cavalry. Jesse James was assassinated by a member of his own gang who wanted the reward money. Younger members of various outlaw groups either went to prison or found legitimate work as the opportunities for train robbery disappeared. But the legend lived on, transformed and sanitized by time and distance. Train robbers who had terrorized innocent passengers became folk heroes fighting against corporate greed. Gunfights that had been chaotic and brutal became examples of American ingenuity and individualism. The reality of train robbery, with its innocent victims and unnecessary violence, was forgotten in favor of a more palatable mythology that emphasized adventure over suffering. The passengers who survived train robberies told different stories. They remembered the terror of sudden violence, the helplessness of being trapped in a steel box with armed men who seemed capable of anything. They recalled children crying, women praying, men trying to shield their families from stray bullets. These memories didn't fit the romantic narrative that was already forming around train robbery, so they were largely ignored by the writers and historians who shaped public perception of the outlaw era. Express messengers, the men whose job it was to protect valuable cargo, developed their own culture of violence in response to the train robbery threat. They were typically former soldiers or lawmen, men who understood that their survival depended on being willing to kill without hesitation. Many carried multiple weapons and enough ammunition to fight a small war. Some booby-trapped their cars with explosives, preferring to die with their cargo rather than surrender it to robbers. The psychological toll on these men was enormous. They rode thousands of miles through hostile territory, knowing that any stop could be their last. They learned to sleep with their weapons ready, to eat with one hand while keeping the other free for their guns. Many developed nervous conditions that today would be recognized as anxiety disorders. Some became so paranoid that they would shoot at their own shadows, creating dangerous situations for innocent passengers and crew members. David A. Truesdale, an express messenger who worked the Denver and Rio Grande line, survived 7 robbery attempts during his career. His journal reveals the constant stress of knowing that he was a target for every desperate outlaw in the territory. He wrote about lying awake at night, listening for sounds that might indicate an approaching attack. He described the weight of carrying weapons that he knew he might have to use against human beings. Most of all, he wrote about the loneliness of a job that few people understood and fewer still appreciated. The economics of train robbery also tell a story about the changing nature of the American West. Early robberies targeted payroll shipments to mining camps and cattle ranches, money that represented the wages of working men. Later robberies focused on commercial shipments and express company strongboxes, targeting corporate wealth rather than individual earnings. This shift reflected the transformation of the frontier from a place where individuals could strike it rich to a region dominated by large corporations and organized capital. The weapons technology that emerged from the train robbery era influenced military tactics for decades to come. The combination of long-range rifles, close-quarters shotguns, and portable explosives became standard equipment for military units operating in similar terrain. The lessons learned about fighting in confined spaces and coordinating attacks on moving targets would later be applied to urban warfare and anti-terrorism operations. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the train robbery era was cultural rather than military. The image of masked men on horseback stopping a locomotive in the desert became a defining symbol of American outlaw culture. It represented the last gasp of individualism against the rising power of corporate America. The final moment when a small group of determined men could challenge the forces of industrial progress and win, at least temporarily. The reality was far less romantic. Train robbers were typically men driven to desperation by poverty, failed businesses, or the inability to adapt to a changing economy. They chose violence not because they were rebelling against injustice, but because it seemed easier than honest work. Their victims were not corporate executives or government officials, but ordinary people who happened to be traveling with valuables that the robbers wanted to steal. As the last of the train robbers died or disappeared into history, their crimes were gradually transformed into adventures. The violence was minimized, the victims forgotten, and the criminals themselves became symbols of a freer, more exciting time, when men could still make their own rules and challenge authority with nothing but courage and fast guns. This transformation of memory served a purpose for a nation that was rapidly becoming urban and industrial, providing a romantic escape from the realities of modern life. The railroad lines that had been the targets of so much violence eventually became symbols of progress and prosperity. The same tracks that had once echoed with gunfire now carried passengers and freight safely across the continent. The stations where outlaws had planned their crimes became peaceful stops where families began new lives in the growing cities of the West. The transformation was complete. The age of the train robber had ended, taking with it the last chapter of the gunfighter era. But on quiet nights, when the wind whistles through abandoned railroad cuts and long unused sidings, you can sometimes hear the echo of those violent years. The sound of horses' hooves thundering across hard ground, the sharp crack of rifle fire, the desperate shouts of men who knew they were fighting for their lives. These ghosts of the past remind us that behind every legend is a darker truth, and behind every adventure story is the reality of human violence and suffering. The steel rails that stretch across the American landscape carry more than freight and passengers. They carry the memories of a time when the law was whatever the strongest man said it was, when justice came from the barrel of a gun, and when the difference between hero and villain depended entirely on which side of the tracks you happened to be standing on when the shooting started. The technology that ended the train robbery era also transformed the nature of law enforcement across the American West. Federal marshals could now coordinate their efforts across thousands of miles using telegraph networks. Photographic evidence made it possible to identify suspects with unprecedented accuracy. Railroad companies hired private detective agencies that operated with resources and authority that local sheriffs could never match. The romantic image of the lone lawman tracking outlaws across the frontier gave way to coordinated corporate security operations that left little room for individual heroics. The economic calculations that had made train robbery attractive also changed as the financial system evolved. Express companies developed new methods for transferring money that didn't require shipping large amounts of cash on trains. Banking networks made it possible to conduct business transactions without physical currency. The payroll shipments that had been such tempting targets for outlaws were increasingly replaced by bank drafts and wire transfers that were worthless to anyone who didn't have legitimate access to the banking system. Insurance companies played a crucial role in ending train robbery by creating economic incentives for better security. Railroads that suffered frequent robberies found their insurance rates rising to levels that made improved protection more cost-effective than accepting losses. This led to innovations in train design, from reinforced express cars to armed guard compartments, that made robbery increasingly difficult and dangerous for potential criminals. The legal system also evolved to deal more effectively with train robbery. Federal courts gained jurisdiction over crimes that crossed state and territorial boundaries, eliminating the safe havens that outlaws had once found by simply riding across a county line. Professional prosecutors and investigators replaced the amateur law enforcement that had characterized the early frontier. Sentences became more severe and more consistently applied as the legal system matured and standardized its procedures. The social impact of train robbery extended far beyond its direct victims. Newspapers sensationalized train robberies in ways that made them seem more common and dangerous than they actually were. This coverage created public pressure for government action and helped justify the expansion of federal law enforcement authority. The mythology of train robbery also influenced public perceptions of the frontier, contributing to images of the West as a place where civilization was constantly under assault by savage outlaws. The decline of train robbery coincided with changes in American society that made such crimes seem increasingly anachronistic. The frontier was closing, and with it, the cultural acceptance of violence as a normal part of daily life. Urban populations who read about train robberies in their newspapers saw them as threats to progress and civilization rather than romantic adventures. Public opinion, which had sometimes sympathized with outlaws who seemed to represent individual freedom against corporate power, increasingly supported law enforcement efforts to eliminate train robbery entirely. The international dimension of train robbery also contributed to its decline. Some American outlaws fled to Mexico or South America to escape pursuit, but they found that foreign governments were increasingly willing to cooperate with American law enforcement agencies. The Wild Bunch's flight to Bolivia ended in their deaths, partly because local authorities there were no longer willing to provide sanctuary to foreign criminals. The globalization of law enforcement made it harder for outlaws to escape the consequences of their crimes by simply changing countries. The psychological profile of train robbers reveals much about the changing nature of crime in the American West. Unlike the gunfighters who had dominated frontier violence in earlier decades, train robbers were often men who had failed at legitimate careers and turned to crime as a last resort. They were typically older, more desperate, and less skilled than the outlaws of popular imagination. Their crimes were often poorly planned and executed by men who lacked the experience or intelligence to succeed in more sophisticated criminal enterprises. The victims of train robbery were also different from those of earlier frontier crimes. Instead of fellow outlaws or armed adversaries, train robbers targeted ordinary passengers, railroad employees, and express messengers who were simply trying to do their jobs. This shift in victims helped turn public opinion against train robbers and made it easier for law enforcement to gain support for aggressive anti-robbery campaigns. The methods used by law enforcement to combat train robbery also evolved significantly during this period. Instead of relying on individual sheriffs or marshals, railroad companies and federal agencies developed systematic approaches that included intelligence gathering, coordinated pursuit operations, and preventive security measures. These methods proved far more effective than the reactive law enforcement that had characterized earlier periods of frontier violence. The role of informants and undercover agents became increasingly important in ending train robbery. Detective agencies infiltrated outlaw gangs and gathered intelligence about planned robberies. Former criminals were recruited to provide information about their former associates in exchange for reduced sentences or immunity from prosecution. These techniques, which would become standard practices in modern law enforcement, were pioneered during the campaign against train robbery. The scientific methods that were beginning to influence law enforcement also played a role in ending train robbery. Ballistics analysis could connect specific weapons to particular crimes. Handwriting analysis could identify forged documents and threatening letters. Photography could preserve crime scenes and document evidence in ways that had never been possible before. These techniques gave law enforcement advantages that outlaws couldn't match with traditional frontier skills. The political dimension of train robbery also contributed to its eventual elimination. Railroad companies had enormous political influence and used it to secure government support for anti-robbery efforts. Federal legislation increased penalties for train robbery and expanded the authority of federal law enforcement agencies to pursue train robbers across jurisdictional boundaries. State and territorial governments competed to demonstrate their commitment to law and order by supporting aggressive anti-robbery campaigns. The cultural legacy of train robbery outlasted the practice itself by many decades. Hollywood films and popular novels continued to romanticize train robbers long after the last real train robbery had occurred. These fictional depictions emphasized the adventure and excitement of train robbery while minimizing its violence and human costs. They created a mythology that was far more appealing than the reality of desperate men committing brutal crimes against innocent victims. The transformation of the American West from a region where train robbery was possible to one where it was unthinkable happened remarkably quickly. Within a single generation, the frontier conditions that had made train robbery feasible disappeared completely. The outlaws who had once terrorized railroad lines either died violently, went to prison, or found legitimate work in the increasingly civilized West. Their crimes became historical curiosities rather than ongoing threats. The economic development that train robbery had once threatened eventually made such crimes impossible. The wealth that moved on railroad lines was increasingly in forms that couldn't be easily stolen or converted to cash. The security measures that protected trains became so sophisticated that robbery attempts were more likely to result in the death or capture of the robbers than in successful theft. The risk-reward calculation that had once made train robbery attractive shifted decisively in favor of law enforcement. The social changes that accompanied the end of train robbery were equally significant. Communities that had once tolerated or even celebrated outlaws increasingly demanded law and order. The frontier culture that had produced train robbers gave way to a more settled society that valued stability and security over individual adventure and excitement. The train robbers who survived this transition often found themselves living in a world that no longer had room for their particular skills and attitudes. The environmental impact of train robbery was also notable, though often overlooked. Successful robberies required detailed knowledge of local terrain, weather patterns, and seasonal variations that affected railroad operations. Train robbers became experts in reading the landscape for strategic advantages, escape routes, and hiding places. This intimate knowledge of the natural environment was part of what made them effective criminals, but it also connected them to a way of life that was disappearing as the frontier became more developed and controlled. The international dimension of the train robbery phenomenon extended beyond individual criminals to influence diplomatic relations and international law. The escape of American train robbers to foreign countries created tensions between governments and led to new extradition treaties and cooperative law enforcement agreements. The pursuit of train robbers across international boundaries helped establish precedents for international police cooperation that would become increasingly important in the 20th century. The technological innovations that ended train robbery also influenced the development of modern security systems and law enforcement techniques. Many of the methods pioneered to combat train robbery were later adapted for use against other forms of organized crime. The communication networks, coordination systems, and investigative techniques developed during this period became the foundation for modern federal law enforcement agencies and corporate security operations. The end of train robbery marked more than just the conclusion of a particular type of crime. It represented the final closing of the American frontier and the complete victory of organized society over individual lawlessness. The trains that had once been targets for desperate outlaws became symbols of progress, prosperity, and the triumph of civilization over chaos. The railroad lines that stretched across the continent carried not just goods and passengers, but the promise of a new kind of American society, where violence would no longer be the primary means of resolving conflicts or achieving personal goals. The last great gunfighter died not in a blaze of glory, but in a hospital bed in El Paso, Texas, on a quiet Sunday morning in 1929. His name was John Selman Jr., and few people remembered that his father had once been famous for killing other famous men. The son had tried to follow in his father's footsteps, but by the time he came of age, there was no place left in America for professional gunfighters. The world had moved on, and the men who lived by the gun had become anachronisms, relics of a time that most people preferred to remember differently than it actually was. As young Selman lay dying of tuberculosis, the same disease that had claimed Doc Holliday decades earlier, he might have reflected on how completely the West had changed. The dusty cow towns where his father had made his reputation were now proper cities with paved streets and electric lights. The saloons where gunfights had once been nightly entertainment were being replaced by movie theaters, where audiences watched fictional cowboys engage in sanitized versions of the violence that had once been horribly real. The transformation had been swift and total. By 1900, most of the famous gunfighters were either dead or had found other ways to make a living. Wyatt Earp spent his final years in Los Angeles, consulting on Western films and telling increasingly embellished stories about his adventures to anyone who would listen. He died in 1929, the same year as young Selman, having outlived the violent world that made him famous by more than 4 decades. Bat Masterson, once the sheriff of Dodge City and a man who had killed at least 4 people in gunfights, ended his days as a sports writer for a New York newspaper. He traded his guns for a typewriter and his reputation for violence for a byline in the sports pages. When he died at his desk in 1921, few of his newspaper colleagues knew anything about his past as one of the most feared lawmen in Kansas. The survivors of the gunfighter era found themselves in an awkward position as the 20th century progressed. They were living reminders of a past that America was trying to both remember and forget. The public wanted the romance of the frontier without the reality of its violence. They wanted heroes without bloodshed, justice without brutality, adventure without consequences. The real gunfighters, with their scars and their nightmares and their uncomfortable truths, didn't fit this sanitized narrative. Some of them tried to profit from their notoriety by joining Wild West shows, performing mock gunfights for audiences who wanted to experience the thrill of frontier violence without any actual danger. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show featured several authentic former gunfighters, including Annie Oakley and various Indian War veterans. But the performances were carefully choreographed spectacles that bore no resemblance to the chaotic, brutal reality of actual gunfights. The audiences ate it up anyway. They cheered for the good guys and hissed at the villains, secure in the knowledge that no one would actually die for their entertainment. The irony was perfect. Violence that had once been desperate and deadly had become safe and predictable. The gunfighters who had terrified the frontier now performed like circus animals, their deadly skills reduced to harmless tricks for the amusement of people who could never understand what they had really been through. Meanwhile, the West itself was being systematically tamed and civilized. Railroads connected every major town, bringing law enforcement, newspapers, and the kind of social pressure that made frontier violence impossible to sustain. Telegraph lines carried news instantly across thousands of miles, making it impossible for outlaws to disappear into the wilderness. Photography meant that wanted posters showed actual faces rather than artistic approximations, making disguise and anonymity nearly impossible. Perhaps most importantly, the economic conditions that had created the gunfighter era were changing. The cattle drives that had brought thousands of armed young men into frontier towns were ending as railroads reached into ranching country. The mining booms that had created instant cities full of desperate men with more money than sense were being replaced by corporate operations that valued stability over quick profits. The opportunities for men to make their living with a gun were disappearing, along with the frontier itself. The weapons technology that had defined frontier violence was also evolving beyond the capabilities of individual gunfighters. Machine guns, high-powered rifles with telescopic sights, and improved communication systems meant that professional criminals could no longer compete with organized law enforcement. The romantic image of the lone gunfighter facing down multiple opponents with nothing but his skill and courage became not just improbable, but literally impossible in a world of coordinated police response and overwhelming firepower. Frank James, the older brother of the more famous Jesse, lived until 1915 and spent his final years giving tours of the family farm to tourists who wanted to see where America's most notorious outlaws had grown up. He would point out the hiding places where the gang had cached their loot, the routes they had used to escape pursuing posses, and the rooms where they had planned their crimes. But he never talked about what it felt like to kill a man or watch his brother die violently. Some truths were too personal to share with strangers. The women who had survived the gunfighter era also found themselves struggling to fit into a changing world. Many of them had been stronger and more independent than their Eastern sisters, forced by circumstance to handle weapons, run businesses, and make life or death decisions that proper Victorian ladies were never supposed to face. As the frontier closed, these women often found themselves expected to return to more traditional roles, pretending that their years of freedom and danger had never happened. Belle Starr, who had been known as the Bandit Queen, was murdered in 1889, possibly by her own son, ending a criminal career that had spanned more than 20 years. But by the time she died, the newspapers were already transforming her from a violent criminal into a romantic figure, a woman who had chosen adventure over security. The reality of her life, which had included multiple marriages, several children, and a string of violent crimes, was less appealing than the myth of the beautiful outlaw who rode with famous desperados. The children who had grown up during the height of the gunfighter era carried its influence with them for the rest of their lives. They had seen things that children should never see, heard sounds that would echo in their dreams for decades, and learned lessons about violence and survival that would shape their approach to every conflict they encountered. Many of them became the business leaders, politicians, and community builders who would define the modern West, bringing a hard-earned understanding of human nature to their endeavors. But they also brought a certain fatalism, a knowledge that life could change instantly and violently, that security was always temporary, and that the difference between civilization and chaos was often just one man's decision to reach for his gun. This understanding influenced everything they built, from the wide streets of Western towns designed to provide clear fields of fire, to the strong law enforcement traditions that emphasized quick, decisive action over lengthy legal proceedings. The graveyards of the Old West tell their own story about the end of the gunfighter era. Boot hills across the frontier filled up quickly during the violent years, then gradually became quiet places, where the only new arrivals died of old age or disease. The wooden headboards that had marked hasty burials were replaced by proper stone monuments. The unmarked graves of unknown gunfighters were forgotten, their occupants joining the ranks of the completely anonymous dead. Some of these cemeteries became tourist attractions, places where visitors could read the names and dates of famous gunfighters and try to imagine what their lives had been like. But the tourists were usually disappointed by what they found. The graves were smaller than expected, the headstones less dramatic than Hollywood had led them to believe. Death, it turned out, was the same for famous gunfighters as it was for everyone else. Final, quiet, and ultimately ordinary. The guns themselves outlived their famous owners by decades. Colt revolvers that had killed men in dusty streets were passed down through families, displayed in museums, or sold to collectors who valued them more for their history than their function. Some of these weapons were still functional, still capable of the violence that had made their original owners famous. But they had become artifacts, museum pieces that spoke to a time when individual skill with weapons could determine the course of events. The stories, however, took on lives of their own. Each retelling added new details, removed inconvenient truths, and gradually transformed brutal killings into noble encounters between heroes and villains. The gunfighters who had lived in constant fear of being shot in the back became legends who always faced their enemies honorably. The desperate criminals who had robbed and murdered for money became romantic figures fighting against injustice and corporate greed. Hollywood accelerated this transformation when the movie industry discovered that Western films were incredibly popular with audiences who wanted to believe in a simpler time, when right and wrong were clearly defined and justice came from the barrel of a gun. The actors who played famous gunfighters on screen became more famous than the real men they portrayed, and their sanitized versions of frontier violence became the accepted truth for millions of people who had never been closer to the real West than a movie theater. By the 1950s, television westerns dominated the airwaves, bringing idealized versions of gunfighter culture into American homes every night of the week. Children who had never seen a horse except in movies played at being cowboys and Indians, sheriffs and outlaws, heroes and villains. The violence was clean and consequence-free, the justice swift and certain, the heroes always triumphant, and the villains always punished. It was everything that the real Wild West had never been. The last men who had actually known real gunfighters died in nursing homes and veterans' hospitals, their stories largely unrecorded, and their truths overshadowed by the more appealing myths that had replaced them. A few historians tried to preserve their memories, but the public preferred the legends to the reality. Truth, it seemed, was less important than the story people wanted to believe about their own past. And perhaps that's as it should be. The real story of the gunfighter era is largely a story of failure, waste, and unnecessary death. Men killed each other over trivial disputes, died young from violence or disease, and left behind widows and orphans who struggled to survive in a world that had little sympathy for the casualties of progress. It's not a story that inspires or uplifts. but rather one that reminds us of the capacity for violence that lies beneath the surface of all human societies. But the myth of the gunfighter serves a different purpose. It speaks to our desire for individual agency in a world that often seems beyond our control. It promises that skill, courage, and determination can overcome any obstacle. That one person can make a difference when it matters most. That justice will prevail if good people are willing to fight for it. These are comforting beliefs, even if they bear little resemblance to historical reality. The wind-swept plains where gunfighters once rode now stretch beneath endless skies that have witnessed the rise and fall of countless human dramas. The towns where they lived and died have mostly survived, though they're now connected by interstate highways rather than cattle trails. The saloons where they drank and fought have been replaced by chain restaurants and shopping malls. The only reminders of their violent era are historical markers that tell sanitized versions of events that were far more complex and brutal than most visitors want to know. But sometimes, in the quiet hours just before dawn, when the wind carries the scent of sage across empty miles, and the stars shine with the same cold light that illuminated frontier violence more than a century ago, you can almost hear the echoes of that vanished world. The jingle of spurs on wooden sidewalks, the creak of leather holsters, the nervous laughter of men who knew they might not live to see another sunset. These sounds have faded into memory, but they remain part of the landscape, woven into the story of a nation that was built by people who were often far more complicated than the heroes and villains of popular imagination. The age of the gunfighter ended not with a bang, but with a whisper, as the last survivors took their secrets to unmarked graves, and the myths they left behind became more real than the reality they had actually lived. It was a transformation that would have amazed the men who had lived through the violent years. But perhaps it was inevitable. Every society needs its myths, and the myth of the noble gunfighter serves America's need to believe that its expansion westward was guided by principles higher than simple greed and violence. In the end, the gunfighters achieved a kind of immortality that few of them could have imagined. Their names are still spoken with reverence and fascination, their stories still told and retold, their images still evoked whenever Americans want to remember a time when individual courage mattered more than corporate power. They became symbols of an America that probably never existed, but that people desperately want to believe in. Perhaps that's legacy enough for men who lived hard lives in a harsh time, who faced their mortality every day with a courage that was all too real, even if the stories we tell about them are largely fiction. The gunfighter era was brief, violent, and often meaningless. But it was also undeniably American in its mixture of individual ambition and collective violence, personal courage and social brutality, mythic possibility and grim reality. It reminds us that the past is always more complicated than we want it to be, that heroes and villains are usually the same people seen from different angles, and that the stories we tell about ourselves say more about who we want to be than about who we actually were. And now, as the night deepens, and the stories of gunfighters and train robbers, sheriffs and outlaws, heroes and villains fade into the comfortable darkness of memory and myth, we can rest knowing that the violent frontier is gone forever, existing now only in the imagination and in the quiet spaces between what we know and what we choose to remember. The guns are silent, the dust has settled, and the only battles left are the ones we fight in our dreams, where the good guys always win and justice always prevails, just like it does in the movies. The archives that preserve the records of the gunfighter era tell a different story than the one most Americans prefer to believe. Court documents reveal the mundane motives behind most frontier killings. Newspaper reports from the period describe violent men committing brutal acts for selfish reasons. Personal letters and diaries speak of fear, desperation, and regret rather than heroism and honor. These primary sources paint a picture of frontier violence that is far removed from the sanitized mythology that replaced it. Modern forensic techniques have occasionally been applied to cold cases from the gunfighter era, revealing new details about famous killings and challenging long-accepted versions of events. Ballistics analysis of preserved weapons and bullets has disproven some cherished legends about famous gunfights. Archaeological investigations of historical sites have uncovered evidence that contradicts popular accounts of frontier violence. These scientific methods provide a more objective view of the past than the stories passed down through oral tradition and popular culture. The psychological study of violence has also shed new light on the gunfighter phenomenon. Modern understanding of trauma, stress disorders, and the psychological effects of violence helps explain some of the behavior patterns observed in historical accounts of gunfighters. Many of these men exhibited symptoms that would today be recognized as indicators of mental illness or psychological disturbance brought on by their exposure to violence and their participation in it. The economic analysis of frontier violence reveals patterns that were invisible to contemporary observers, but are clear to modern historians. The correlation between economic downturns and increased violence, the relationship between resource scarcity and conflict, and the role of economic inequality in creating conditions for violence all become apparent when frontier crime statistics are examined with modern analytical tools. The gunfighter era was not just a product of individual choice and cultural values, but also of economic forces that created incentives for violence. The environmental factors that influenced frontier violence have also received attention from modern historians. Drought, extreme weather, and natural disasters often preceded outbreaks of violence as communities struggled for scarce resources. The geography of the frontier, with its vast distances and limited transportation networks, created conditions where law enforcement was weak and violence could flourish. Understanding these environmental influences helps explain why frontier violence took the forms it did and why it eventually declined as these conditions changed. The social networks that connected gunfighters across the frontier were more extensive and influential than previously understood. Many of the most famous gunfighters knew each other, worked together, and influenced each other's careers in violence. These networks helped spread techniques, weapons, and attitudes across vast distances. They also created a subculture that reinforced violent behavior and made it difficult for individuals to escape the gunfighter lifestyle once they had entered it. The role of alcohol and drug use in frontier violence has been recognized by historians, but its full impact may have been underestimated. Frontier communities often had limited access to clean water, making alcoholic beverages safer to consume than water from questionable sources. Opium and other drugs were widely available and often used for medical purposes. The combination of readily available intoxicants and widespread weapon ownership created volatile conditions that frequently erupted in violence. The medical knowledge available on the frontier was primitive by modern standards, which meant that many gunshot wounds that would be survivable today were fatal in the 19th century. This increased the stakes of any violent confrontation and may have influenced the psychological calculations that led men to resort to violence. Knowing that any gunshot wound might be fatal made the decision to draw a weapon a more serious one than it would be in a world with modern medical care. The legal system of the frontier was often corrupt, ineffective, or simply absent, which created conditions where private violence seemed like the only available form of justice. Men who might have relied on courts and law enforcement in more settled areas found themselves forced to settle disputes through violence. This breakdown of formal legal institutions contributed to the development of the informal codes of honor and violence that characterized frontier culture. The technological changes that ended the gunfighter era happened with stunning rapidity. The same innovations that had made frontier violence possible, such as reliable revolvers and rapid transportation, eventually made it obsolete. Communication networks, advanced forensic techniques, and coordinated law enforcement eliminated the conditions that had allowed gunfighters to flourish. The frontier that had existed for barely a generation was transformed completely within a few decades. The cultural memory of the gunfighter era has been shaped more by commercial entertainment than by historical evidence. The economic incentives that drive the entertainment industry favor dramatic, simplified narratives over complex historical realities. This has resulted in a popular understanding of frontier violence that emphasizes its most sensational aspects while ignoring its social, economic, and psychological dimensions. The political uses of gunfighter mythology have also influenced how this period is remembered. Politicians and interest groups have invoked the image of the frontier gunfighter to support various causes, from individual gun rights to American exceptionalism. These political appropriations of frontier history have often involved selective emphasis on certain aspects of the gunfighter era while ignoring others that don't support the desired narrative. The international perspective on American frontier violence reveals how unique some aspects of the gunfighter phenomenon were to American culture and conditions. While other countries experienced frontier violence during their periods of expansion and development, few produced the specific combination of individual gunfighters, romantic mythology, and cultural celebration of violence that characterized the American West. This suggests that the gunfighter era was not just a product of frontier conditions, but also of specifically American cultural values and institutions. The ongoing fascination with gunfighter history in American culture suggests that these stories continue to serve important psychological and cultural functions. They provide a way for Americans to explore themes of individual agency, moral complexity, and the relationship between violence and justice in a relatively safe historical context. The continued popularity of Western entertainment and the persistent interest in gunfighter history indicate that these themes remain relevant to contemporary American culture. The responsibility of historians and educators to present accurate accounts of frontier violence remains an important consideration. As the last living connections to the gunfighter era disappear, the responsibility for preserving and interpreting this history falls entirely to scholars and teachers. Their decisions about how to present this material will shape how future generations understand this important period in American history. The lessons that can be drawn from the gunfighter era remain relevant to contemporary discussions about violence, law enforcement, and social order. The conditions that created and sustained frontier violence, including weak institutions, economic inequality, and cultural acceptance of violence, continue to influence patterns of violence in modern America. Understanding how these forces operated in the past may help in addressing similar challenges today. The transformation of the American West, from a region characterized by individual violence to one governed by institutional authority, represents one of the most successful examples of large-scale social change in American history. The mechanisms that accomplish this transformation, including economic development, technological innovation, and institutional reform, may offer insights for addressing violence and instability in other contexts. The human cost of frontier violence should not be forgotten in discussions of its historical significance or cultural meaning. Behind every gunfight, train robbery, and saloon killing were real people whose lives were cut short, families who were destroyed, and communities that were traumatized. The romantic mythology that has grown up around frontier violence often obscures these human costs, but they remain an essential part of the historical record and should be remembered along with the more dramatic aspects of the gunfighter era. The evolution from frontier violence to institutional order in the American West represents a microcosm of broader processes of social development and state formation. The same patterns that transformed violent frontiers into peaceful communities can be observed in many other historical and contemporary contexts. The American West thus serves as a laboratory for understanding how societies develop the institutions and norms necessary to control violence and maintain order. As we close this exploration of what gunfights were really like in the American West, we're left with a more complex and nuanced understanding of this pivotal period in American history. The reality of frontier violence was neither as romantic as popular culture suggests, nor as simple as either heroic or villainous narratives would have us believe. It was a human phenomenon, shaped by specific historical conditions and individual choices, that offers important lessons about the nature of violence, the development of social order, and the ways that societies remember and mythologize their past. The gunfighters are gone, but their legacy, both real and imagined, continues to influence American culture and identity in ways that are both profound and subtle.